Hi everyone, welcome to Business Ethics 322. Today is our first lecture. We'll talk about utilitarianism. So I'll talk about the basics of utilitarianism in this lecture. We'll talk about Bentham, Williams. We'll talk about Mill and some contemporary critiques. I would like to start this lecture with two thought experiments, which will give us a lot of questions. And I hope that we could have these questions with us as we walk through the basics of utilitarianism. And that might be provoke some thought for us. So I uploaded two videos about those two thought experiments, so please check them out on the course page. So the first is Nozick's experience machine. So Nozick argues that so he imagines there is such a machine that if you walk into it, you would sleep forever and be in dream. But you would dream of the happiest things that you can ever imagine. So basically in your dream, you would have like maximized happiness, and the dream would feel just like reality. And you wouldn't feel like you're dreaming. Basically, you are living like your dream life in that machine. But it's just not real in reality. It's just your brain in there. So why are we talking about this? It's because we're talking about utilitarianism in this lecture, which talks about, which is the ethical doctrine that tries to maximize happiness. So it tries to argue for something like, what is the most moral and ethical, what is good, is to maximize the happiness of everyone and bring the maximized happiness to the most people, or bring a maximum of amount of happiness to this world. So this seems to be a philosophy that focuses a lot on happiness. However, a lot of people wouldn't want to walk into Nozick's experience machine. They would prefer to have less happiness in the real world. They would prefer to accomplish something genuine and hold their loved ones in reality. Even if their relationships and accomplishments in the real world wouldn't be as perfect as in that machine, they would prefer something to be real. So it seems that a lot of people would agree with that. So maybe happiness wouldn't be the most important thing in the world. Maybe a lot of other things are worth prioritizing. For instance, real or truth. The other thought experiments talks about a city called Omilas. A lot of you might have heard of it. So this is a utopian city that's filled with festivals, happiness, and prosperity. And there is no poverty or pain or illness in the city. Every citizen is having the best day of their life every day, and they have the most happiness possible. However, this utopian city comes at a grave cost. So for all these citizens to have all that happiness, a child has to suffer and has to be locked in a basement, living in terrible conditions. So the residents of Omilas are aware of the child's existence and the price of their happiness. So the narrative kind of raises questions about the ethical implications of sacrificing one individual for the greater good of the community. So some people are shocked or angry or sad about this child suffering and torturing. However, as they grow up, they kind of accept it. Some individuals cannot accept this, so they choose to walk away from Omilas. They would rather live in somewhere they are less happy, or maybe somewhere that they are miserable even. But they prefer all that over living in the city where a child has to suffer for them. So again, for those people who chose to work away from Omilas, it seems that they prioritize something over happiness. And a lot of people will find this narrative of Omilas wrong, and a lot of people would find this very unsettling, very bothering to them. So it seems that as humans, we prioritize something over happiness. So those two thought experiments seems to tell us that there are more things, other things that are more important than happiness, right? In that case, maybe those pose some challenges to utilitarianism. Maybe utilitarianism has some deep flaws. So so with that kind of idea and questions, so let's delve into the basics of utilitarianism. And let's see if you change your mind at the end of the lecture after you have heard what the philosophers have to say about utilitarianism and about happiness and about what's good. The first philosopher I would like to talk about is Bentham, probably like a signature figure for utilitarianism. So Bentham proposes the principle of utility. So he argues that we should approve or disapprove actions based on their tendency to augment or diminish happiness. So basically this means that if something gives us more happiness, we should approve that and consider that to be ethical and to be good, and vice versa. So what is utility? So it just means that something that produces pleasure or happiness or advantage and prevents pain or harm. Bentham argues that we should maximize utility in the world, and whatever maximizes utility for us should be considered as good and as ethical. And okay, so it seems that he talks about pleasure as if it's something to be measurable, right? He speaks of like the maximum amount of happiness. He talks about augmenting or diminishing happiness as if it's something that you can basically quantitatively measure. He talks about maximizing something, right? So it seems that at the back of his mind, he attached numbers to pleasure and pain. He thinks that you can have more pleasure in the world or less pleasure in the world. So how do we measure? How do we calculate? So Bentham proposes a set of criteria. So intensity, duration, certainty, uncertainty, propinquity, fecundity, remoteness, purity, and extent. So intensity just talks about like how intense your happiness is. So so maybe eating a bag of chips is just like a mildly intense level of happiness. But let's say you achieve like your biggest dream ever, or let's say you eat like your favorite food ever. That might be a much more intense happiness you're experiencing, like comparing to that bag of chips, like especially if you don't like chips that much. And also duration, so how long you have your happiness. So certainty and uncertainty talks about how likely that happiness is likely to occur. And then propinquity talks about the nearness or immediacy of the effects of an action. So in the context of pleasure and pain, propinquity considers episodes of pleasure or pain that result directly and immediately from an action. So if someone helps a friend in need, the immediate joy and relief experienced by the friend are examples of propinquity. So the positive effects are closely connected to the action. But let's say I become a great pianist after I've played the piano for 50 years, right? And and maybe at the end of that 50th year, I won like a great prize from a piano competition. But that's after 50 years. That's very remote from now, and it's not immediately following the actions I have right now and the actions I practice every day. In that case, so that kind of happiness of becoming a pianist kind of so it just has the last score on the criteria of propinquity. Then, on the contrary, remoteness deal with the effects that occur at a later time, so more distantly related to that action. So saving money regularly might bring financial security and peace of mind in the long run. So the sense of security is a remote consequence from the action of saving money. Fecundity talks about the likelihood that an episode of pleasure or pain will be followed by additional episodes of the same kind. So, for instance, you read a very thought-provoking book. It may not only bring immediate pleasure, but may lead to further pleasures through contemplation, discussion, or related activities. So the act of reading in that case is fecund. However, if you, let's say, do something illegal, that might give you some pleasure, but it will be immediately followed by punishment and coercion and maybe being locked up. So it would be followed by pain. It wouldn't be followed by additional episodes of pleasure. So in that case, kind of doing something illegal wouldn't be fecund. And also purity. So purity refers to the likelihood that an experience will not be followed by experiences of the opposite kind. So consuming a delicious chocolate bar may provide immediate pleasure, but if it leads to severe stomachache afterward, the pleasure lacks purity. So the experience is hinted by subsequent pain. And also extent talks about, so the last criteria, extent, talks about the number of persons whose welfare is affected by an action. If you ask Bentham, what do you think is good or ethical? He would say that what is good or ethical brings the most utility to each individual affected based on those criteria. So that means each time to morally evaluate an action, you have to go through this procedure of calculating the utility for each individual affected by that action you are evaluating. And your procedure has to go through each criteria on the list and calculate like a net result for each individual affected. So for instance, let's say I stole some hamburgers from the local McDonald's, and now let's say we have 6 people in the community, and now you are evaluating whether my action is moral. So now you calculate the utility for each of these 6 people affected, so all people in the community. And so basically for the first person, you go through the effect of my action. You go through how my action leads to pleasure or pain for the first individual going through this criteria list. And then you go through this list again and you calculate at the amount of utility my action generated for the second person, and it goes on, and we cover every single individual affected. Now we have a net result of the amount of utility I brought to this world by stealing a hamburger from the local McDonald's. And if that kind of net result, if that kind of calculated result says something like my action does bring a lot of utility to the world, then that's ethical. If it doesn't, or it kind of brings more pain comparing to pleasure to the world, then it's bad. It's not ethical. So Bentham's philosophy goes like this. Intensity and duration are the 2 main factors for measuring pleasure and pain. So that might speak to our everyday experience. And the idea here is to assign numerical values to episodes of pleasure and pain, making them completely commensurable. Pleasures and pain of any sort could be put on a common numerical scale for comparison. So the pleasure of eating a bag of chips, the pleasure of holding your loved ones, the pleasure of becoming the best athlete in the world, all these different pleasures, no matter what they are put on a common numerical scale for comparison. That means when you calculate all these different types of pleasures, you don't distinguish them, you don't tell them apart, and you don't worry about there might be different kinds of pleasures. All pleasures are the same, and they are put into the same common numerical scale. And a very important point here is that Bentham does attach numbers to pleasure and pain. So he thinks that pleasure and pain are something you can quantitatively measure, that you can basically have a numbered score for. So, as you can see, Bentham has this common numerical scale for comparison. That just means he doesn't tell apart between different types of pleasures and different types of pain. He considers all pleasures, all pain as the same, and he doesn't kind of do separate treatments when he does the calculation. And also, another note to make is that Bentham's theory requires that calculating the utility of a single action is not sufficient. We have to calculate the balance an action brings forward, and we want the action that brings the highest balance of utility to this world. So what is this general tendency of an act? So this is a concept that's pretty central in utilitarian ethics. It refers to the typical or predictable consequence of a certain kind of action, rather than the specific consequences of a single instance of that action. So it looks at the overall pattern of outcomes that a certain type of action usually produces. It evaluates whether the type of action generally promotes happiness, or reduces suffering, instead of focusing on the immediate outcomes of a particular act. So, for instance, so it doesn't talk about what is the consequence for me picking up this earphone, or me throwing my rubbish in front of my neighbor's door. It doesn't talk about this particular action, but it talks about like general kinds of actions, such as stealing, such as praising others, or helping others, or killing or murdering. So it talks about a general type of action, talks about a category of action. It talks about an archetype of action instead of a specific action you performed this morning or just now. So one note to make here is that Bentham's theory doesn't talk about human rights. It doesn't inherently include a concept of inalienable human rights. So many contemporary utilitarians don't agree with that, and they argue that you should protect human rights. And only if you protect human rights, you can maximize long-term happiness. So I think what the contemporary utilitarians are doing actually improves utilitarianism a lot, because the original version by Bentham does seem to be very problematic in terms of human rights. So think of the story of the ones who walk away from Romulus. It seems that human rights, if it's not in the theory, we can be led to very problematic scenarios. And this version of utilitarianism, if it doesn't involve a central concept of human rights, sometimes we might alienate humans, and we might accept sacrificing some people for other people. And that can be problematic for a lot of people, right? For utilitarianists, there are kind of scope for those who matter for their moral considerations for utilitarians, their principle of impartiality also includes non-human animals in moral calculations. So they care about animals as well when they calculate kind of your utility and your consequences of actions. So Bentham thinks that what should determine whether someone or some subject should be a focus or be a concern of our moral considerations should depend on whether they have a capacity to suffer. So Bentham argues that if something has that capacity to suffer, even if they are not rational, like animals, they should be an important focus of our moral consideration. So he famously asked, it doesn't matter whether they're rational, but can they suffer? If they can, if something can suffer, then we should care about it and include it in our moral calculations. And the framework or the kind of calculation procedure we just talked about that includes all 7 different criteria that you calculate a number for each person, and then you have like a sum or a net amount of utility. This process of calculation or framework of calculation has a name. It's called hedonic arithmetic or hedonic calculus. People have questioned whether a calculus of pleasure and pain is in theory possible, especially regarding intensity. Can the intensities of all these different happy and painful experiences be put on some common scale of measurement? How can we compare pleasure and pain experienced by different individuals? So how can you compare the pleasure of hearing your favorite music or going hiking or spending time with your family or eating a whole bag of popcorns? It seems that it's hard to tell which one is more intense. And also, some people may be more inclined to feel pain. Some people may feel pleasure always in like a more intense way than others. Some people just in general more kind of sensitive to their feelings and emotions. So how can you compare all these? And I think a lot of people would also argue that, do you think really the best pursuit in the world is pleasure and avoidance of pain? A lot of people would argue that a lot of other things are important, like care or kindness or human rights or duty or a lot more things might matter a lot more than pleasure and avoidance of pain. And we also talk about Williams and Mill, who also propose some critiques regarding Bentham. Williams then go on and critique Bentham's theory. So Williams argues that if you give numbers and values to states of affairs, you will eventually have to accept this resulting notion of negative responsibility. As a result, you would be tied to this notion. So firstly, what is negative responsibility? So negative responsibility just means that individuals are as responsible for things they allow or fail to prevent as they are for the things they actively bring about. So you are not just morally responsible for the consequences of your direct actions, but also for what you allow to happen by not acting upon something. And William finds that notion problematic, and he thinks that utilitarianism essentially forces you to accept this notion. And Williams argues that the fact that utilitarianism forces you to accept this doctrine of negative responsibility, it essentially leads you to something called the principle of impartiality. So the principle of impartiality argues that everyone's happiness or suffering is weighted equally, regardless of personal relationships or individual identity. So for instance, you should be willing to save 5 strangers instead of your best friend if it maximizes happiness. You should be willing to sacrifice all your friends and families if it saves the rest of the world. So this principle of impartiality just talks about you should only care about people's happiness and maximizing people's happiness and reducing people's suffering. And you shouldn't care one person more than any other persons when you make decisions about your actions morally. William's critique here is that utilitarianism essentially leads you to negative responsibility, and negative responsibility essentially leads you to this principle of impartiality. And Williams find these extremely problematic because he thinks that the principle of impartiality requires individuals to prioritize maximizing overall happiness, even if it means sacrificing personal problems with the principle of impartiality. So, for instance, if you can kill one person to save others, would you do that? If someone is a strict utilitarian, they would argue that you should kill that person and maximize overall happiness. But where is your personal integrity? So sometimes some people argue that the principle of impartiality doesn't accommodate personal integrity, which is very important for a lot of us. And also, if you adopt this principle of impartiality, you cannot have personal commitments, you cannot have personal projects, you cannot value one person more than like a stranger you've never met, even if you love this person so deeply and so much. And that is problematic as well, because our personal commitments and projects and relationships are essential aspects of our identity and moral agency. And if utilitarianism just focuses on the outcomes and gives equal weight to every single person, this will alienate individuals from their own actions and moral feelings. So William argues that there is a need to consider the deeper implications of actions and decisions. And we have to think about personal commitments and how that's deeply intertwined with our moral identity. A strict utilitarian perspective might just alienate us and ignore a lot of things that are important to us, so we might need a more nuanced and contextual approach to address moral dilemmas effectively. So that was William's critique. So there is also another objection to Bentham's theory. So Bentham's quantitative hedonism was attacked by a lot of philosophers. Those philosophers argue that this is a moral philosophy unfit for humans because it essentially reduces human life to the pursuit of base animalistic pleasures, essentially equating humans with pigs or other animals. They argue that humans are capable of higher, more sophisticated pleasures like intellectual, emotional, or moral pleasures, but animals like pigs or swine are driven only by physical or sensory pleasures like eating, sleeping, mating, and the basic needs kind of pleasures. And they argue that human life is just reduced to the second. But while there is so much more, they argue that Bentham's doctrine basically is a moral philosophy that argues there is no better and nobler object of desire and pursuit. But humans are so much better than that, as they argue. So they argue that it's not a doctrine worthy of being kept. And as a reply, we have Mill's qualitative hedonism. So Mill, like Bentham, wants to save hedonism, wants to save utilitarianism, and he wants to save the idea that happiness and what is good should be what's maximizing pleasure and leads us to the absence of pain. However, Mill differs from Bentham's purely quantitative approach, which measures pleasure solely based on intensity and duration and attaching numbers and stuff. Mill argues that which will deal with the doctrine of swine objection. He argues that if we have a purely quantitative utilitarianism, it neglects and ignores higher human capacities for intellectual aesthetics and moral pursuits. So the kind of critique we just talked about. Mill agrees with that. So he tries to reconcile those critique with utilitarianism and kind of modifies and further develops utilitarianism. So Mill argues that there is pleasure produced by our higher faculties like intellectual, aesthetic, and moral pursuits. And there are pleasure produced by lower faculties like merely sensory and bodily faculties. So there's this distinction. He now makes distinction between different types of pleasures, but Bentham didn't, as you recall. So here we can use the example of the musician Haydn and the oyster example to think of this. So this is a famous example proposed by Mill. So an oyster lives very long. If this oyster keeps flowing peacefully in the sea for a very long time, there will be a point at which the amount of happiness experienced by that oyster exceeds the amount of happiness experienced by Haydn. But can we say that we all want to be an oyster over being Haydn? What about the fulfillment caused by writing great music? What is about the pleasure of being able to help a lot of people, feeling transcendence and acceptance by my music? Should we just all be oysters? Some people find this intuitively wrong. So that means different types of pleasure does matter, and the distinction between different kinds of pleasures is very important. So based on this, Mill introduces a qualitative hedonism, emphasizing that not all pleasures are equal in value. So Mill go on and argues that quality is what we should think about here. We should think about the quality of pleasures and the different qualities of pleasures, and the higher kind of quality pleasure and the kind of lower quality pleasure distinction. And how do we know that which qualities belong to the higher category, which ones belong to the lower category? How do we distinguish between different qualities of pleasure? How do we determine the qualities of each pleasure we have? So here introduces the concept of competent judges. So he argues that we have these groups of competent judges to answer those questions. So who are those competent judges? So the competent judges include people who have experienced all the pleasures of different qualities in the world. They're competent because of their experience and developed capacities, and they're capable of appreciating and enjoying a wide range of pleasures, including both bodily and higher intellectual and aesthetic pleasure. So they've seen everything, and they have developed this capacity to basically have a great appreciation for any type of pleasure, and they have very good understandings of those. Since they have experienced both the pleasure produced by the higher faculty and those produced by the lower faculty, Mill thinks that they would be able to clearly tell them apart because they have experienced those. And in this way, Mill thinks that we should listen to their testimonies and treat their testimonies to be our evidence and kind of theoretical basis for distinguishing between different types and qualities of pleasures and the higher and lower categories of pleasure. And Mill argues that he is confident that if we go and ask those competent judges, they will tell us that they think the pleasures produced by higher faculties are more desirable. So a lot of people find this problematic because Mill was just like, I'm confident here that they will tell you the answer I have in mind. How do you know? A lot of people didn't like Mill's argument there, and he was like, that wasn't an argument, that wasn't evidence. It was just you being very confident, but you're just asserting an opinion. But why should we be convinced? So a lot of people didn't like what Mill was doing there. There are also other objections to Mill's work and this doctrine of qualitative hedonism overall. So firstly, critics have argued that Mill's qualitative hedonism faces a dilemma. So if quality is intrinsic to pleasure, this means it only has to do with the pleasantness of pleasure. Therefore, a higher quality happiness is more pleasant than a lower quality one. Then a higher quality is just improving the intensity and duration of happiness, making it quantitative. So it's still the same thing that Bentham suggested. So if quality concerns with things other than how pleasant the experience is, it abandons hedonism. Mill isn't necessarily in a hopeless position. Mill might save his theory. So for instance, Mill might respond by insisting that quality is a separate thing from intensity and duration that gives value to pleasant experience. So I think what matters here is that it's kind of ambiguous. Like you say that there is a higher faculty or like a higher quality pleasure, but what does this higher quality mean? If it's just more pleasant, then that's just intensity and duration. If you are not talking about intensity and duration, what is this kind of higher you're talking about? What does that even mean? So probably the real problem or question here is that there is a kind of vagueness or ambiguity there regarding this word or phrase, higher quality. So the real problem probably came from Mill didn't clarify his language enough there. So maybe if he clarified his language and kind of introduce new modifications to it, he probably can save his theory. So for instance, he can argue that this quality he's talking about is different from intensity and duration. And he might argue something like, even if two experiences have the same duration and intensity of pleasantness, quality is introduced as the separate dimension that makes more valuable, that makes one valuable and the other less valuable. And this value isn't necessarily quantitative. It doesn't necessarily lead to more intensity or duration. So this is a separate thing that we are talking about here. So my understanding of this is a little like music. So music can be louder, longer, but there is also this dimension of tone or quality of sound. So those are different. And the tone or quality of sound and the kind of feelings this sound gives you is a separate thing, a separate dimension. So I feel like that's what Mill is talking about there. But people have also argued that Mill is still vague. He's still unclear. So you say this quality is different. What is this quality, right? What does it look like, right? How do we capture or sense those qualities? So people feel like he didn't talk enough about this notion of quality, so it's still kind of mysterious what he means by quality. The second critique people have is that Mill is just appealing to experts. So Mill relies on competent judges for evaluating the quality of pleasures. The worry is that experts might be biased. Experts can be wrong. And Mill's method can also be circular because he already presupposes a preferred ranking. So he kind of already presupposes like there are the qualities of pleasures. If he was trying to select or find competent judges, he has to already have that assumption in position. But that is what he was trying to kind of prove. So people were like, Mill's method is kind of already assumed. It assuming what he is trying to prove or find. And also, how do we know these experts will reply the way we expect them to reply? How do we know that these experts will tell us things that Mill says they'll tell us? And do competent judges even exist in this world? So there are a lot of worries and concerns floating around here. And a lot of people think that even when we were in primary school, we were told not to just listen to experts, but also but to think and to critically engage with any opinions we're given. Is Mill kind of failing on that? So there are a lot of worries floating here. The Mill was like, he was trying to save this theory and kind of establish some kind of justification or grounding for this theory. So he was like, I'm going to prove this theory. But Bentham has argued that the principle of utility cannot be strictly proved. So Mill acknowledges that. Mill argues that, you know what, we can't, in a strict sense, prove the principle of utility and utilitarianism, but we can have a more relaxed, broader, more flexible interpretation of proof. So we cannot in like a strict way prove it, but maybe we can in a more loose way, more kind of broad way prove it, or we can offer different kind of proof for this theory. So here is Mill's proof, probably with quotation marks, of principle of utility. A lot of people argue that this is not actually proof. And it has a lot of like fallacies within it. Mill himself probably acknowledges it, but he still thinks there is a value to this kind of three-stage argument. He thinks that there is still some kind of knowledge or truth or insights generated by this proof, even though he acknowledges that this isn't, in a strict sense, a proof. So Mill aims to establish three conclusions here: the intrinsic goodness of individual happiness, the intrinsic goodness of general happiness, and the sole intrinsic goodness of happiness. So I'll not like read through those three stages. You can look at it. You can pause and look at it. And a lot of people feel like, you might feel after you've read it, you might feel like this doesn't seem to be like making a lot of sense. A lot of people feel like there are a lot of loose steps and kind of jumping ahead and jumping steps going on here. Probably you share the intuition that this is not a strict proof. So people have also offered critiques of Mill's proof. So critiques have argued, firstly, that Mill's argument in stage 1 commits the fallacy of equivocation. So the fallacy of equivocation just means that one word in English can have many different meanings. I'm using one sense in the earlier part of the argument, then use a different sense of the word in a different part of the argument, and basically secretly changing the subject in the middle of my argument. So of course you would be led to weird conclusions. So people argue that Mill did the same here. So the different occurrences of the word desirable in the first stage of the argument actually have different meanings. So Mill had secretly used the word in different senses there and basically secretly changed the subject of the argument there. The second critique is the fallacy of composition. So the properties of individuals doesn't automatically make the group of the collection of these individuals have such properties. So if everyone in the band is second best musician in the world, so let's say in this band, the keyboard player is the second best keyboard player in the world, the drummer is the second best drummer in the world, the singer is the second best singer in the world, it doesn't make the band the second best band in the world. Maybe this band doesn't coordinate well, or maybe they just don't go well together, or maybe there are different standards for evaluating bands. compared to evaluating musicians, or maybe they cooperated really well, so they really beat it, the best musicians out there, and they are the best band in the world. So the point is, even if each individual had certain properties, it doesn't make the collection of them have those properties. If in a class or in this class, maybe a lot of us have certain properties, but this doesn't make our group have that property. Or if you have like in your family, if a certain property is shared by all your family members, that doesn't necessarily mean like your family as a whole has that property. So the goodness of individual happiness does not necessarily extend to the goodness of general happiness. So Mill probably made a mistake there. People also argue that there should be Mill's argument relies on a very complex notion of happiness composed of a lot of different elements. So people also debate the plausibility of how Mill understands the relationship between happiness and other intrinsic goods. So I think, in other words, Mill's kind of notion of happiness here is way too complex that probably it needs more treatments. Mill probably should have said more about how all these different elements fit together with each other and how they fit into the picture of other intrinsic goods we have. But I guess a lot of us kind of acknowledge the overall possibility of utilitarianism. And a lot of us might think Mill is problematic. So if you feel like you agree or disagree, so let me know more in the discussion posts. Let's talk about some more contemporary critiques of it. So the book chapter asks you to read by Mark Timmons talk about critiques of utilitarianism. So Timmons is actually from the University of Arizona philosophy department. So he's a very cool philosopher. And the book we use, I think, is one of the best textbooks in the world. So Timmons talks about practical objections against utilitarianism. So he feels like it's very difficult to make real life decisions with the principle of utility. We can't really determine the status of actions in situations involving ignorance or uncertainty about actual outcomes and their associated utilities. So for instance, if I see someone lying on the street, if I go and perform a CPR, he might become better, he might not. He might die because of my CPR. Or sometimes maybe you've made a donation to, let's say, the UNICEF, and then it's unclear like how much contribution your money actually made. Sometimes we're just ignorance of the consequences of our actions. Sometimes it's just uncertain. Or as a teacher, maybe you told your students some very kind words or you've encouraged them. It's just kind of uncertain. Maybe it's certain that you certainly influence them in a good way, but it's just uncertain like how much you've influenced them or if you actually influence them and like what kind of pleasure it brought to them. So in the real world, it's not all black and white. We have a lot of gray areas. We have a lot of ignorance and uncertainty and vagueness and a lot of answers we don't know. So we can't really calculate utility about a lot of actions. For instance, if I'm teaching a class, I talk about a lot of ethics and philosophy. I would never know what would be the actual outcome of me trying to do my best when I'm teaching. I wouldn't know like where the students are in a few years and whether it actually made their lives better or worse, right? I don't know like how much pain it caused them or like maybe it continued to harm them because it didn't teach them something properly. I wouldn't know any of that. So it seems that utility can only be a moral criterion. It's not a decision procedure. And right, imagine you're a business owner. Now you're trying to make a decision and you're trying to be utilitarian about it. It's going to be very hard for you to use the utility principle. It's very hard to calculate the utilities of all these different alternative actions. You have to think about each person impacted, all these lists of criteria. It's just impossible, right? Especially if you have like a big business that's going to influence a lot of people in the world. Or let's say you do like exportation and stuff, or you sell things globally. How can you even calculate like the utilities of all your alternative actions involving so many people, right? And you are not God as well. You can't foresee the consequences of your actions. You can only to a certain extent anticipate, but you can't predict accurately, right? So it seems that as a business maker, if I tell you you're going to make business decisions using utility principle, that would be impossible and that would be stupid to do, right? So maybe this is just like a moral concept of expected like a moral consequence utilitarianism guiding theory or like a moral work, and it remains in that area. It cannot be a decision procedure. So expected consequences, it can only fulfill theoretical assessing the likelihood of but outcomes, it cannot fulfill. We can now take this account into our calculations. So now you don't have to be God. It's much easier to have an accurate kind of grasp of the likelihood of outcome instead of accurately foreseeing and predicting the impact of your actions. So maybe this gives us a better perspective when we try to apply utilitarianism. Tim has also talked about the subjective principle of utility, so the SPU. So an action A performed in circumstances C is presumptively subjectively right if the agent believes that A has as high an expected utility as does any of the available alternative actions that she believes are open to her in C. In cases where only one act is judged to have the highest expected utility, that action is subjectively obligatory, and all others are subjectively wrong. So basically, the subjective principle of utility brings into this kind of actual dimension of subjectivity. So you don't have to be God. You just have to, in that second, perform the action you believe to be the best alternative that brings the most utility. So basically, we are obligated and required to perform whatever we believe to be the highest expected utility kind of bring action. So it's kind of, and it doesn't have to be the actual action that brings the most utility. So so it kind of like, even if the outcome of your action is disastrous, if you perform whatever you believe to be the best thing to do in that occasion, you were morally good. You should be considered as a good person. Your action should be considered as good and ethical. So it just kind of brings the focus back to what's happening inside of us, to what we believe, to our beliefs and faith. So that's much easier, right? Because we don't know like what the rest of the world is doing. We don't know like how each individual in the world will be impacted by my business, but I know what I believe, and I can have a clear grasp of that and be certain of that. So that makes it much easier and brings a lot of certainty into it. But even for a principle like this, even if you are appealing to just your beliefs, it's hard and it's impossible to apply it every single time when we make any moral decisions. It will make our life so hard. So think about you're a business owner. You make probably 50 decisions every day. You can't just like sit down and do a meditation and try to figure out what you believe is the best. Sometimes we just have to act with our gut intuition. Sometimes we make decisions before we even have enough time to think about it, right? So this seems to be too harsh or too high of a requirement for a lot of people, for business owners, for ourselves. Because if you look at your life every single day, and you will probably make 500 decisions that are morally relevant. You bought the ramen in the store. Is that involving child labor? The plastic you just bought, is that environmentally friendly? You just talk to your professor like on the corridor. Is everything you said to him like kind? So there are a lot more decision we make every day than you imagine. And then we can't just sit down and do a medication for each of it every single time. It's still not realistic. Utilitarians themselves are aware of such limitations of the principle of utility in practical decision making. And they still try to save that theory because they think there are some important insights in that theory. So as an answer, we now have a two-level approach to moral thinking. So this is like a new model they propose. So the first level thinking is guided by moral rules. This happens in ordinary, non-conflicting, non-controversial situations. And second level thinking involves conscious deliberation when rules conflict. So basically, there are a lot of like kind of standard moral rules we just have to follow. You don't have to think, just follow these rules. Only start having a meditation about what you actually believe and go through a procedure like what the SPU just suggested when they conflict. So individuals don't have to be trained to consciously apply principles like SPU in all moral decisions, but we can use moral rules to guide our behaviors in most situations. But like, who figures out these moral rules, what those moral rules should be, right? So maybe stealing, and also like, for example, a moral rule is something like this. So if stealing in most cases will bring pain, or killing in general brings pain, so maybe we just make it like a general moral rule in that killing is wrong. Only when maybe killing is wrong and saving a person is right. Only if you have to kill to save someone, like only in those contradictory, conflicting cases, you have to start thinking about what you actually believe. But in general, you can just follow like helping people is right, so I help people today. Killing people is wrong, and in general brings pain to the world. So today I don't kill, something like that. So in general, you don't have to think about much, and you don't actually run into like conflicting cases that much. So utilitarians think that at the end of the day, maybe we can find a way to save it. So utilitarianism is a pretty, I think, a big ethics topic, and a lot of utilitarians till today are still working on utilitarianism and ways to save it. So if you're interested in this, you can go on Google Scholar or Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to see more efforts and modifications and developments utilitarianists have done. I would think in terms of the relevance to business ethics, the kind of Bentham, Williams, and Mill's theory are probably not realistic for us to apply them in business situations. But I do think those frameworks Timmons has talked about and this kind of two-level approach are things we can actually implement in real-world business decisions. So that might be something to think of for your project, and it's also something that you might think of for like actually making real life decisions in your business, in your life, in your projects. And I also put down like links for some projects utilitarians have done, what they have called effective altruism. This is a link to the video I uploaded on long-termism. So if you're interested, I would highly encourage you to look at those. And thank you so much for listening to this lecture. See you in the next lecture. Thank you.